Welcome to the Bob Unger Show. We have a very timely, probably the most important show I've ever done. And our guest is Rob Muchnick. Rob has devoted a good deal of his life to learning the truth about Israel and the Middle East conflicts. And of course, this is very timely because of the barbarians' attack on Israel on October 7th. But we're not going to just point the finger at the barbarians. We're going to point the finger at the zookeepers who are supposed to keep the barbarians in the cage. And if a zookeeper allows a tiger to be released from the cage and kill all the innocent children at the zoo, do you blame the tiger who's just doing what comes naturally to him? Or do you blame the zookeeper? So we're going to delve not into the surface of what you see in the phony, fraudulent media and the fraudulent politicians of both the right and the left, because much of the right wing is also fake and phony. And Rob, I met you, what year was that?
Probably 2004.
Okay. So that was 1 year before Israel kicked the Jews out of a region in Gaza called Gush Katif with an F. And of course, you predicted that if they gave that land to the opposition, the Arabs, the Muslims, it would be used as a launching pad for rockets and attacks on Israel. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So I guess you're a genius, and the government of Israel, they must all be morons, because only a genius could have figured out that would happen. And so, Rob, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in Gaza or the Gush Katif. And then we'll take that to Gaza and all the issues it opens up and the Hamas attack. And we'll talk about all the things that people have been brainwashed into believing. And we'll take those things apart, those concepts apart. It's the old expression that I think actually Reagan used, which is, it isn't that you're ignorant, it's just that everything you know is not true. And that applies to most Jews and to most Gentiles alike, of any religion, because they're all brainwashed. So let's get into what happened to you in Gush Katif and how it activated you and how that was a sort of epiphany for you.
So about that time, I saw what Israel was about to do, that Ariel Sharon announced that Israel is going to leave Gaza, which was 21 communities, plus another 4 in the northern part of Shomron, which people derisively call the West Bank. We can get to that later. Or we'll get to it now, actually. They call it the West Bank to remove the Jewish connection to the area. The area is called Judea and Samaria, and obviously Jews come from Judea, whereas Arabs come from Arabia. Makes sense. So if you want to disconnect Jews from an area, what do? You destroy the history, and you change the name to the West Bank, which sounds very sterile, but it certainly doesn't sound Jewish. You can throw Jews out of the West Bank, but you can't throw Jews out of Judea. So Gush Katif is also part of the land of Israel as delineated in the Torah. And it just didn't sit right with me that the government of Israel was going to throw Jews out of their houses in the land of Israel and hand it to people who want to annihilate us. I mean, you don't need to be a prophet, or you didn't need to be a prophet to see this. And you could see all of the government ministers on both sides justifying this soon to be horrific enterprise of throwing 10,000 Jews out of their houses.
And Rob, just 1 second. We should add that Sharon was the prime minister who threw the Jews out and gave it to Hamas, in effect. But we should also point out that the current prime minister, Netanyahu, voted in favor of throwing the Jews out. Is that correct?
Well, to be absolutely correct, he didn't just vote one time, Bob. He voted 3 times in favor of throwing the Jews out of Gush Katif and all the other 25 communities. Bibi Netanyahu, as long as we're going to get to him, he had such a spine. He said publicly he's not going to support it without Ariel Sharon calling a public referendum, a national referendum, and he gives Ariel Sharon 15 days to call this referendum. So this is kind of like the guy in the 2 kids on the playground, and one draws a line in the sand and says, if you step over this line, that's it. I'm gonna beat you up. And then the other kid steps over the line, and the first kid takes a step back and draws a new line and says, step over this line and I'll beat you up. So that was what Bibi did. He waited till day 14 and he said, okay, I didn't mean it, and no referendum, and I'm still supporting it. And Bibi, the so-called right-winger, had the political power on his own to stop this disaster, and yet he chose to enable it by voting for it and having all the people who followed him vote for it, basically because the Likud party was pretty much split in two, with a number of people supporting Sharon and a number of people supporting Bibi. So Bibi had the power to stop it and chose to not use that power, but instead to help Sharon destroy Gush Katif. And it gets worse because Bibi doesn't stand by his votes in support. 3 weeks before the disaster was going to be implemented, and after it couldn't be stopped politically anymore, Bibi resigned from his ministerial position in order to make everyone think that he opposed it the whole time. But he actually voted for it. So there you go, your little 2 cents on Bibi, the so-called right-winger.
Exactly.
So
go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So Gush Katif, it just didn't sit right with me. How could Jews possibly throw Jews out of their houses in the land of Israel collectively and hand it to those who want to annihilate us? And how could this possibly lead to anything good? So the more I looked into it, the more I saw the only reason Ariel Sharon did it was to avoid criminal prosecution for himself and his 2 sons, because they took illegal campaign contributions from 3 places, and the Attorney General found out about this. The Attorney General's office was run by Shimon Peres, who, as everyone knows, was a super leftist and wanted to create the state of Palestine in the land of Israel at all costs. And so, even though Ariel Sharon ran for re-election less than a year before he changed his mind and supported this plan, Ariel Sharon's re-election campaign was no unilateral withdrawals. Then him and his 2 sons get caught with their hands in the cookie jar by Shimon Peres, and literally 3 weeks later, they proposed this quote-unquote disengagement from Gaza. So Ariel Sharon even went so far as to say, as Netzarim goes, which was a big community in the Jewish Gaza, so goes Tel Aviv. So basically, he told his voters that we're not leaving Gaza. That Netzarim is the same as Tel Aviv. And a few months later, after they were caught, threatened with pending investigation by the Attorney General, we have the disengagement. And all of this is detailed in a book by a couple of Israeli journalists called Boomerang. So if you want to find it, that's where you can find it.
So it's kind of like Trump saying he's going to drain the swamp.
It's kind of like Trump saying he's going to drain the swamp. So yes, so I didn't think that this was going to be anything good. And there's a million reasons why it wasn't going to be good. One was because it's the land of Israel, and we're going directly against God by handing land that he gave to us to those who aren't us. Doesn't matter if they're Switzerland or Canada or people who want to annihilate us. If God gives you something, you really shouldn't give it away. You know, if I give you something, if I give you a present, I come to your house and I give you a bottle of wine, I'm not going to be happy if you turn around and give it to the next guys when you go to somebody's house for dinner and you give the bottle of wine I gave you. I mean, and then we're talking about what God gave us. Okay. Further, clearly this was bad for security. And if you want to take a look at what the Haaretz, which is, they consider themselves the New York Times of Israel, they're the left-wing paper of record in Israel, and they said the disengagement plan is bad for the economy, it's bad for security, it's bad for the peace process, but we support it anyway. And how could they possibly support it? What was their rationale? Well, their rationale was it will destroy the influence of the religious Zionists in Israel to set the national agenda for the foreseeable future. So there you go. So they admitted it's bad for security and it's bad for the peace process, but they still supported it. So it's crazy. So I saw all of this and I said, you know what? I can't just sit on my sofa in America and do nothing and just and speak about it. So I got on a plane and I snuck into Gaza, past a few checkpoints, and I made the IDF drag me out of a town called Shirat Hayam. I was on a roof, and it was an absolute disaster. I asked the kids, there were probably 50 soldiers surrounding me for a number of hours. And so I had a chat with them, and I said, are you helping or hurting your country today? And they said, I don't know. And I said, what are you doing today? Well, we're defending democracy. Well, they don't know what democracy is. When Ariel Sharon says no unilateral withdrawal, and he gets elected on the biggest landslide in Israeli election history, and then a few months later he changes his mind, that's the opposite of democracy. I said, would you shoot me if they told you to? Probably. And would you knock down the wall in Jerusalem if they told you to? Yeah. So this is what we're facing. We're facing kids, young kids in Israel who are brainwashed to follow orders at all costs. And we gave it to the Germans for following orders. And yet we're really good at following orders now. Very sad.
And it's also should be pointed out that Israel sent more soldiers and spent more money on military equipment to, in effect, attack the Jews of Gush Kativ and throw them out physically than they spent in the Hezbollah war.
Absolutely. That is 100% correct. Israel used 55,000 soldiers to throw out 10,000 unarmed, not fighting Jews from their homes in Gush Katif. And less than a year later, they used 30,000 soldiers to fight an actual war against Hezbollah, and which we lost. Israel actually lost to Hezbollah. Hezbollah killed over 160 Jews. And Ehud Olmert was then the prime minister. he took over from Sharon after Sharon had his strokes. And Olmert decided to try to win that war without ground troops, only with air power, because the theory being, if you can win a war only using air power, then you can give away Judea and Samaria and only defend it through the air and not have to have people on the ground there. So he tried to do that. It was a terrible failure for Olmert and for the Israeli army and for everything. It was just a disgrace how we lost to Hezbollah. Yes, so you're right that we use roughly half the soldiers to fight a real war against people trying to kill us than against Jews trying to stay in their houses. And I kind of had I had a suggestion to the Jews of Gush Katif on how to avoid being thrown out of their houses. And they said, yeah, how do we do that? I said, do a mass conversion to Islam. I said, they won't throw you out. They'll let you stay there.
Yeah.
Got a few
And they'll
chuckles.
give you aid with cement and petrol.
They'll give you aid with cement and petrol.
And
So
what was handed over in Gush Katif to the Arabs when the Jews were thrown out? What did the Arabs get that was there? And what did the Arabs do with it?
well, the Jews gave over their 21 communities, which included super advanced greenhouses, which made millions and millions and millions of dollars of produce, which Israeli farmers were able to sell and export. And it was tremendous opportunities for the industry. And literally within 48 hours, within minutes of handing it over, actually, the greenhouses were destroyed by those that Israel tried to help.
It worked as well as the government war on poverty in America.
And the war on drugs too.
Yeah, right. They could have made a fortune, and what they do, they burned it all down, which shows you that their hatred and their dedication is more than most people. They hate the Jews so much they'll forego the benefit of millions of dollars in potential income just to destroy anything that has a remnant of Jewish connection to it, which is what they want to do to the whole region. Now, let's talk about, since this is in the news so much, all of the lies that everyone believes, because they're a bunch of brainwashed sheep. And it's not just the Jews, it's everybody else, the sheeple. Let's talk about some of those lies. And by the way, to the audience, Rob is going to show you in PowerPoint form exactly what he's talking about, because most of the things that we know would not be believed by most people, because most people are so naive, they think you find virgins in a house of prostitution. But unfortunately, you don't. And therefore, they can't believe that the government, any government, is not their mommy and their daddy, because their mommy and their daddy would never betray them. So therefore, the government wouldn't possibly betray them. So let's get into that. Let's get into all the lies, and let's show the viewers the God's honest truth.
Well, that's what we're here for, Bob. So let's do it. So, but okay. So first, yes, October 7th happened. You see quote unquote Palestinians, and I'll get to why I call them quote unquote Palestinians in a moment. You see Palestinian supporters. On the one hand, they revel in the resistance, in the great resistance that was shown to the great Satan, Israel, on October 7th, and yet in the next breath, they deny that it happened. So depending on the context, as we know, context is a big concept for Americans, well, particularly those who run American higher educational institutions. But so October 7th, these savages, and I don't want to insult savages, but let's just call them savages, because these people crossed the border with Israel and committed acts of barbarism, of savagery that I don't think the modern world has seen. At least not for many, 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 many years, and certainly not on television. They crossed the border, they went into Jewish communities, they raped women, they murdered babies, they cut fetuses out of pregnant women and stabbed the fetus and then shot the mother, all in front of the other children, raped women, raped men, walked around Jewish communities as if they had all the time in the world, which led me to wonder, how did they have all the time in the world? How did they know that they had all the time in the world? So, and how did they have such good information? Well, it's come out that they had such good information because the thousands and thousands of Gazans who were allowed into Israel to work on a daily basis made maps and notes of where everybody lived and who was home when and who should be attacked. That's something else that needs to be discussed. So these people had roughly 6-7 hours of unopposed time to commit acts of savagery and barbarism, which are unheard of, and if anybody wants to tell you that this is an act of resistance, they're resisting against fetuses, against children, against 10-month-olds, against 85-year-old grandmothers, against people dancing. The justification for this is not possible. It's just not possible to justify, to be an actual human being and justify what they did. Not possible. This is barbarism versus civilization. This is light versus darkness. This is good versus evil. It's completely biblical. It's completely. Now, getting back to what you said, Bob, about the lions, do you blame the lions or do you blame the zookeeper who opened the cage? Well, how did they have 6 to 8 hours completely unopposed? It's mind-boggling. I mean, within 15 minutes after they crossed the border, surely they were doing their savagery. The Israeli authorities were getting phone calls. You know, I don't know what the number is in Israel that you dial, but here you dial 911 for help. Obviously, they were getting tens and hundreds of phone calls, and there was no response. There have been reports that the drones that flew over the fence line were removed 3 days prior to the attack. There were reports by Efrat Fenixen, a completely legitimate reporter, and she said that 60 to 80% of the troops, of the Israeli troops in the Gaza Belt region, were removed shortly before and transferred to the north of Israel. Jonathan Pollard himself, who knows something about sacrificing for the Jewish people, he spent 30 years in prison and another 5 years pretty close under basically house arrest in Manhattan for helping the Jewish people back in the 80s, which saved thousands of lives because in the Gulf War I, Saddam Hussein didn't put his poison gas on the tips of the 39 Scud missiles that he sent into Israel because Jonathan Pollard told Israel that Iraq had poison gas. And so every Israeli had safe rooms from gas. So why are you gonna risk international wrath to put gas on your rockets when it's not even going to accomplish anything? So he didn't. So how many thousands and thousands of lives were saved because of Jonathan Pollard? And Jonathan Pollard made a public statement that he spoke with a helicopter pilot, an Israeli helicopter pilot, who sat on the tarmac for 6 hours, begging his supervisor to take off and fly to the border and help his fellow Jews and Israelis. And he was not given permission to take off for 6 hours. This pilot said he could literally hear the gunshots. He literally got phone calls from friends of his in the communities that were being attacked, begging for help. What could he have done with an attack helicopter? Well, obviously he could have done a hell of a lot. And certainly, if he had the courage not to follow orders, like Jonathan Pollard didn't follow orders and save thousands. If this pilot had the courage to not follow orders and to take off his helicopter and fly to the border, how many of our hostages wouldn't have been taken? How much of this disaster wouldn't have happened? And obviously, his other helicopter pilots on the same tarmac would have followed him. They would have said, okay, he's going, well, I'm going to go too. It takes one person to have courage, and nobody did, because it's so ingrained in their minds to follow orders. So I don't know why the government of Israel allowed this to happen, but if we want to have a discussion, you get the helicopter pilot and you say, who gave you that order not to take off? Then you bring him in, and then you say, who told you not to allow the pilots to take off? And you see where it goes. Clearly, there are some bad things happening. Further, the New York Post and the New York Times both reported about 10 days ago that the government of Israel literally had a document which was the exact Hamas plan. They had this document a year ago. And both of those papers just reported that Israel poo-pooed it and said, oh, Hamas is nothing. Let's just ignore it. But based on what I've discussed previously, it doesn't appear that they just ignored it. It appears that it was facilitated, which is worse, clearly worse. It's not just hubris. There is some kind of rot in the Israeli government and or the Israeli army, which helped this attack, which is just so awful to consider. But if someone is honest, how can you reach any other conclusion?
Well, most Jews will never believe it. Wouldn't matter how many facts you throw in their face, because this is the same mentality that rejected what Jabotinsky was telling the Jews when he told them to get out of Germany, because Hitler means exactly what he's intending to do, and they all wanted to deny it. And these are the same people that will call you a conspiracy theorist, when in fact you're nothing but a conspiracy factist, not a theorist. So, Rob, let's go into the background of this entire mishigas between the Jews and the Arabs and the rest of the world. Let's go into the history of Israel and how everyone knows everything that's not true, and let's show them what is true on the screen.
Okay,
So
sure. So I'm going to share the screen now. So this is Bob. This is the the Western Wall, right here, with the Temple Mount on top, with the Dome of the Rock sitting where Solomon's temple used to sit, sitting on top of the ruins of our two holy temples. This is really what it's about. In 1967, Jordan, even though they had an agreement with Israel not to attack us in the upcoming 67 war, they decided to attack. And the Israeli soldiers took the old city of Jerusalem and recaptured this. And from 48 to 67, Jordan controlled the holy sites. So was it important to the Muslims? There was not one Arab or Muslim leader who visited the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque in that time period. So it doesn't really seem to be particularly important until the Jews control the site. At that point, it becomes very important for them. So why I'm showing you this picture is what's missing here is the Israeli flag. The Israeli flag is not on our holiest site. When the soldiers took the site in 67, they put the flag up, and the Israeli government, led by Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, came by. He saw the flag up. He said, having the Israeli flag on top of on our holiest site where the Temple Mount belongs, where the Temple Mount is not my dream, because the Jews are going to want to rebuild the temple, and they're going to want to take down the mosque, and they're going to want to pray up there. This is not my dream. And he handed sovereignty of our holiest site to a group called the Islamic Waqf that day. And ever since, we have been the quote unquote occupiers, because if your holiest site isn't yours, then you are the occupiers. So that's why Israel gets a bad name, and why the present government of Israel can never win the PR battle, because in theory, we are the occupiers. If we're not saying this is our land, then it must be their land, right? Which is a disaster. And until Israel gets a leadership that will embrace our Jewish identity and put the flag up there, and at first build a shul up there and give Jews unfettered access, because right now, if a Jew prays on the Temple Mount, they will be arrested by the Israeli authorities, which is an utter disgrace.
So the Israeli government arrests Jews for praying.
Yes, it does. The Israeli government commits apartheid against Jews. Arabs and Muslims have full rights here. Jews are second-class citizens. That is the definition of apartheid. I hate to throw that word around, but if anything, Israel has a two-tier system against religious Jews, which is a disaster. So now, here's another slide. This shows what the land of Israel is, as delineated in the Bible. This is where the 12 tribes were when we crossed over into Israel across the Jordan. So now our Bible is called the Tanakh. Jerusalem is mentioned almost 900 times in the Tanakh. The Quran mentions Jerusalem 0 times. So if you're a religious person, which one who's got a better right? So now, if we're gonna talk about this, about the rights to the land of Israel, if we're going to talk about this, the Jews have a much better right. But now, what's going on with the Israeli government? Well, you got the Israeli government. Here's a quote from a man named Ron Pundak, who was the architect of the Oslo Accords. He was the chief negotiator for Rabin and Perez, Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the the Oslo Accords with Yasser Arafat. And if you read this quote, this is what it was about. I want peace so that there is Israeliness. Peace is not an end in and of itself. It is the means with which to bring Israel from one era into another, to the era that I consider to be normal statehood. He wants the Israelization of society instead of its Judaization. And sadly, that is what the governments of Israel work for. They want to they want to further the Israelization of Israel at the expense of her Judaization. And what does that mean? It means to lessen Judaism, lessen God, and increase making Israel into the Singapore of the Middle East, which really there's no point. And here, even Benjamin Netanyahu, the right winger, wrote a book, Israel, A Place Among the Nations. Now, the Jewish national mission is to be a light unto the nations. You can't be a light unto the nations if you're among the nations. So this is Bibi showing that he is really in line with what Ron Pundak was talking about. So now,
in other words, he's a globalist.
this is right. He's a globalist. He wants one world government. And you need to, the left and the right, both in Israel, really are both against the Judaization of the state. Now, the left, let me unshare my screen here for a sec. The left in Israel are the socialists and communists. Now, in socialism and communism, there is no God besides the state. So clearly they're against Judaism, and that's why Ben-Gurion didn't want the holy sites, and why he told Jordan not to, if you don't attack us, we won't attack you, and you can keep the holy sites. But the right-wingers are the globalists, and they want a one-world government, and they're also against the Judaization of Israel, because you can't have a one-world government with Israel standing for God alone. That an Israel that stands for God will never merge into a one-world government. So they sound right-wing in comparison to the socialists, but they're only right-wing to the point where they want a better deal. They want to make sure the PLO lives up to its end of the bargain before they give them the state of Palestine. And what are the Palestinians, and who are the Palestinians? And what are their claims to Israel? Well, okay, I'm going to start sharing again. And here we go. Here's Yasser Arafat saying, the Palestinian people have no national identity. I will give them that identity through conflict with Israel. They have no national identity. That's pretty crazy. Here's another one. Yasser Arafat saying, we're the descendants of the Jebusites. Another time he says, we're the descendants of the Philistines. Another Arab-Israeli member of parliament, there is no Palestinian nation, never was. Here's Hamas saying, half of the Palestinians are Egyptians and the other half are Saudis. The current PA president, Abbas, Jesus was a Palestinian. And then you have Saeb Erekat saying, we are Canaanites, lived here thousands of years. You know, these people, they don't know which end is up. They just throw everything against the wall. They take the pasta that they're cooking and throw it against the wall and see what sticks. You know, but in reality, here's a picture of a town in Israel called Shechem. This is the tomb of Joseph, biblical Joseph, who Moses carried his bones out of Egypt when we left. In 1900, there was nothing around it. Nothing. 100 years later, There's close to 1 million Arabs around it. So these people were not here for time immemorial, from time immemorial. They came in the 20th century. The PLO had, if you listen carefully, sometimes they even tell you the truth. Here's a public statement from PLO Executive Committee member Zuhair Hussein in 1977. The Palestinian people does not exist. This guy is Arafat's right-hand man. The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel for our Arab unity. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people, since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism. So what does he mean here? What he's talking about, Bob, is that everybody roots for the little guy against the big guy in a fight. So when the little guy was Israel against the giant Arab and Muslim world, everybody voted against the Arabs and for Israel. So how the Arabs have better PR than we do. So what did they do? They created this fictitious people called the Palestinians. In 1964, they created it because until 1964, the Palestinians were actually the Jews. If you call somebody a Palestinian, the first person that people think was the first leader of the Palestinians was a guy named Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in 1920. And he said, "Don't call me a Palestinian. I'm not a Palestinian." But somehow he's regarded as the first Palestinian. So the point was they turned themselves into the Palestinians, making themselves into David against and turning Israel into Goliath. So, which was great for PR. And the problem for Israel was, if you're not going to embrace your identity, you're allowing the side with no legitimacy to claim the legitimacy. When we run from the Temple Mount and who we are, we're creating a vacuum. And the PLO stepped right into it. And they took the legitimacy, which they don't have. And here we are. So further proof, the PLO was founded in 64. In their original charter, they said they have no claims to the West Bank or Jordan. I mean, the West Bank or Gaza. No claims, none. 3 years later, after the 67 war, they changed their charter to say, oh, okay, now we have claims to the West Bank and Gaza. You know, so it's all a load of garbage. It's all lies. It's simply to get rid of the state of Israel. It's to end Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. That's all this is about, ending Jewish sovereignty. And here is Haj Amin al-Husseini. Where is it? Where is he? Here is a picture of Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Abbas and Arafat's mentor, sitting in Berlin during the war with Adolf Hitler. Hitler felt he could use the Arabs because of their maniacal hatred for the Jews, and so he did. Al-Husseini raised 200,000 Bosnian Muslim SS troops for Hitler. They were reputed to be among the most savage of the SS, if that's even possible. He had plans for building a new Auschwitz in Israel when Rommel would arrive. Thank God Rommel didn't arrive. And at Nuremberg, a few years later, Al-Husseini was given credit for giving Hitler the idea to annihilate us instead of just deporting us. Now, I don't know if I'm buying that, but it was at least said about him. And certainly it's believable that he told Hitler that because that's what he wanted to do, to us. He led the Arab riots against the Jews in 1920, in 1929, in 1936 to 39, where hundreds and hundreds of Jews were brutally savaged, just like happened in October 2 months ago. Here's a little note that this picture kind of sheds some light on what this conflict is about. All of the green is the Muslim world, which is roughly 1,200 times the size of Israel, and yet somehow dividing Israel will bring peace to the area, which is kind of a crazy concept here. So you want to get to the more modern history. We have here we see the British mandate for what they call the British Mandate for Palestine, which at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire basically died, and England and France carved up the Middle East, and Britain took the Palestine Mandate, and they said they would create a homeland for the Jews in that land. 6 months later, 1922, I think, they illegally cut off 80% of roughly 80%, which is labeled here as Transjordan, and made it inaccessible to Jews. They said no Jews can live there. That's 80% of what was called Palestine, and handed it to the Hashemites, who lost out in a power struggle a few years before to the Saudi clan in Arabia. So the Hashemites were said to have given a little bit of aid to Britain during World War I, which they really didn't. Just Britain wanted to use them to stick it to the Jews. So they gave them Transjordan, which they later changed the name to Jordan. But the Hashemites have no connection at all to that area, none. So if you wanted to create a state called Palestine, there it is. They've got roughly the same size population in Jordan, 11 million people, on 4 times the land as in Israel. All you'd have to do is take some of the people from the Israel side and move them to the Transjordan side. And like I said, they've got 4 times the land of Israel. And that includes all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, and by West Bank, I mean Judea and Samaria. So it's all garbage. So now, 27 years later, we move to this, the picture in the middle. And the picture in the middle, the UN offered Israel the blue parts. Basically, 3 disconnected small parts of land. And that was too much for the Arabs to handle. So what did they do? 7 Arab armies attacked Israel, and Israel gained most of the areas that were earmarked for the state of Palestine, which the Arabs voted against. They could have had their state. They would have had so much more than they're theoretically asking for now. Although Hamas is more honest than the PLO. Hamas says they want to annihilate Israel and kill all the Jews, whereas the PLO just says that in Arabic. In English, they say they want to have peace. But of course, they don't mean it. They've never changed their charter, which still calls for the destruction of Israel. And here you have a fellow named Khaled Abu Tuameh, who is a so-called Palestinian reporter who writes for the Jerusalem Post. Seems to be an honest guy. I've met him. He said he understands the Arab behavior. He knows the Arabs want to kill Israel, destroy Israel, and kill the Jews. He understands them. He doesn't understand the Jews. The Jews know what the Arabs want, and they still try to make concessions. And they still try and create Palestine.
So, in other words, a Muslim reporter wondering why the Jews are so dumb or
One,
perfidious.
dumb or perfidious, right? It doesn't dawn on him that they're perfidious against their own people. He doesn't understand that the Israeli, there's a disconnect between Am Yisrael and the Israeli leadership. But then again, most of us don't. Most of us don't get that. And it's a disaster. So so here we go. I know another big thing that's very popular to say now is, oh, Israel, we have to get rid of Hamas. I mean, Hamas is the one enslaving the Gazan population, right? We hear that everywhere, Bob, right?
Yes.
So is that true? Is that really, really true? So let's take a look at what the population of Gaza is really like.
Are you referring to the so-called innocent people?
Yes, the innocence, the innocence of Gaza, definitely. Here we go. So this is, obviously when people are born, everyone is born innocent. The problem in Gaza and Judea and Samaria is from the time that these kids can walk, probably earlier, they are in their mother's milk. They imbibe hatred of Jews and the desire to annihilate Israel at all costs. So this is from 1998. This is a typical Palestinian Authority TV show. You have looks like a 3 or 4-year-old little girl singing about killing Jews. How can you defeat that? And then in 2002, here's another TV show on Palestinian Authority television, interviewing two 12-year-old girls.
In July 2002, two articulate 11-year-old girls were interviewed in the studio of official Palestinian television. Among other topics, they spoke of their personal yearning to achieve death through shahada, death for Allah, and of a similar desire they said exists in every Palestinian child.
حكيت عن الشهادة كشيء جميل، أنت بتعتقد إنه شيء جميل؟
الشهادة كتير شيء جميل جدا جدا. كل الناس بتتمنى الشهادة.
أيوة.
لأنه يعني إيش في أحلى من إنك تروحي على الجنة.
طب مين أفضل، السلام مع وجود حقوق كاملة للشعب الفلسطيني ولا الشهادة؟
الشهادة.
أيوة.
أنا أخذ حقي بعدين أستشهد، لأنه بدنا نعيش إحنا طفولتنا حياتنا. طبعا الشهادة أحلى. لأنه إحنا هلا بدناش الدنيا، بدنا الآخرة.
أيوة.
مش الدنيا اللي حتفيدنا، الآخرة. عشان هيك طبعا يعني إنه كل الشباب الفلسطينيين يعني مش زي أي شباب ثانيين. دمهم حامي. طبعا أكيد بفضلوا الشهادة لأنهم فلسطينيين.
خليني أسألك سؤال بصراحة، هل أنتم بطبعكم بتحبوا الموت؟
في فرق بين الموت والشهادة.
لا، الآن أنا بحكي عن الغياب بمعنى الموت، الغياب الجسدي، هل أنتم فعلا بتحبوا الموت؟
ما فيش أطفال بتحب الموت.
أيوة.
لكن أطفال فلسطين أخذوا فكرة إنه هذه شهادة، إنه عندهم مثلا إنه الموت شهادة، وهذا إشي كتير كويس. إنه مثلا كل طفل فلسطيني ولد مثلا قول له عمره 12 سنة يا رب استشهد.
So becoming a shahada means a martyr for Allah, means killing Jews for Islam. You simply can't win against this. You can't take this out of people. I mean, the odds of taking this out of people, they're imbibed, it's in their mother's milk from the time they're born. How can you possibly get this out of them? I don't know. Do you know? Do you think you can?
I wouldn't try. I would get them out of Israel. That's what I would do.
Clearly, that needs to be. So now, but you want to, do you think anything has changed? So now here's a new video from 21 years later from just now. Let's take a look at what's going on right now. Okay, that's the wrong one. Here we go. This is from last week. So this is happening right
It
now.
sounds very peaceful.
Sounds very peaceful. These little kids, that what, they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, singing and dancing and praying for martyrdom.
What have at least
So this
discussed
is this is happening now. And how does this, we see how this plays out because thousands of them crossed the border and took part in the savagery on October 7th. And there were different waves. And the third wave was just civilians who walked across, including children. And at least in one instance, one of the savages gave a 10-year-old boy a gun, and the 10-year-old boy murdered Jews. So it's really hard to separate the people from Gaza from Hamas, considering they elected Hamas. The second party was the PLO. Those two, which feels no different from Hamas, the two of those got over 90% of the vote. Most of the remaining 5 to 10% were other terror groups like Islamic Jihad. There's potentially one party that may or may not have wished to live in peace with Israel. Maybe they got 5 votes. They pushed an agenda of simply having economic advancement for Gazans. So I couldn't figure out whether they would also support the destruction of Israel, but they were wanting to focus on economic advancement. So it's a disaster. And then I'm going to show you something which is absolutely shocking. Another video. This is in 2000. A couple of Israelis made a wrong turn and drove into Ramallah. And they were lynched. They had their insides ripped out. They were thrown out of the police station into a mob where their bodies were stomped on, and it was cheered on by thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Let's take a look at this.
Two reserve soldiers lose their way.
Oops. Here we go.
Two reserve soldiers lose their way and drive into Ramallah by mistake. They are arrested by the Palestinian police and are taken to a local police station.
Police make little effort to stop the mob, and some even join the crowd in lynching the soldiers to death. The dead soldiers' bodies are thrown out of the window into the clutches of the angry crowd.
It's kind of shocking. It's beyond kind of shocking. This is insanely shocking. But the ones who, on our side, want to create the state of Palestine in Israel, they just pretend this doesn't exist. They think, well, you give them some more economic opportunities and you can have peace. But you can't buy peace. You can't buy peace, certainly not here. These people are more interested in killing us than having a nice job. So there needs to be a separation of peoples. There's not enough room on roughly 20% of Palestine for two separate nations, and one of them wants to kill the other one. There's not enough room. I don't know who said it, but they made a nice statement that hope is not a strategy. I mean, you can't risk your lives by putting the people who would do these things, this kind of barbarism, in charge of your security. And take a look at this one, Bob. An Arab poll, I forget the name of the outfit, but it's an Arab poll, said 98% of Palestinians say that the October 7th attacks made them feel prouder to be Palestinian. That's 98%. So if you want to take into account the margin of error, it could be 99 to 100%.
Well, we also have to mention the overwhelming majority of Jews who are dumb enough to be willfully ignorant. Notice I said willfully ignorant, because all of this information that you're giving out is available to anyone who has the character to care enough about it. And yet they continue to promulgate all the ideas that are the enemies of the Jewish people. And I'm talking about Jews now. I'm not talking about the Arabs. The Arabs, it's very obvious. But the enemy within is more dangerous.
Oh, the enemy within is very dangerous. I mean, we have a friend who I don't have the right to say his name, so I won't say his name. But a few decades ago, he was living in Israel, and he felt like we do. He was an honest Jew, proud Jew, one who cared about Am Yisrael greatly. He was told, if you don't leave Israel, we're going to kill you. So he left, came to America. He had a young family at the time, and so he left. He thought better of it. But the enemy within is right. There is an enemy within. The Israeli establishment and Am Yisrael have their interests intersect sometimes, but oftentimes they don't intersect. And so the Israeli establishment goes after its own interests, and Am Yisrael's interests suffer. So in this conflict, you have Am Yisrael on one side, the people of Israel on one side, And on the other side, you have the Israeli establishment, you have the so-called Palestinian establishment, and you have the Palestinian people. So you have those three parties standing together against the state of Israel, against the Israeli Jewish people. It's a tough concept to comprehend, and most of us don't want to comprehend it. But what other conclusion can we draw? I mean, what is the purpose of this attack on Gaza now? What is the purpose? Is it to further the peace process, the fraudulent peace process, to create the state of Palestine? When these people don't want a state, they've had the chance to have a state a half a dozen times over the years. Anytime they want a state, they could simply stop attacking Jews for 6 to 12 months, and 99% of the Israeli public would demand the creation of the state of Palestine for peace. And yet they can't stop killing us. They just can't. It's kind of like the fable where a scorpion wants to cross the river. I forget what kind of animal he wants to ride across on. Do you remember the animal he wants to ride?
Was it a crocodile or an alligator?
I don't know if it was an okay, so I'm not sure what it was. Maybe a duck? I don't know. So the scorpion says to the duck, let's say, can I ride across the water on your back? And the duck says, no, because if I give you a ride across the water, you're going to sting me. And we're both going to die because you can't swim. And I'm going to die and you're going to drown. And the scorpion says, well, why would I do that? If I sting you, I'm going to die. So I'm not going to do it. So the duck says, okay. So the scorpion goes on the back of the duck. They get halfway across the river and the scorpion bites the duck. Duck says, now we're both going to die. Why'd you do that? Well, I am a scorpion. That's what scorpions do.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, the average person thinks that a scorpion can become a puppy dog.
A scorpion can become a puppy dog. Exactly. So now you have another claim that the people who call themselves Palestinians, let's be more correct. We'll call them Fakistinians, because that's what they are. A couple of Egyptians, Yasser Arafat and another guy, got together with some help from the KGB and formed the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964. And as I showed before, Arafat said, the Palestinian people doesn't have an identity, I'll give them one. Well, there you go. So, and it's kind of a miracle how they were founded in 1964 to oppose the occupation of 1967. I find that amusing.
Well, they were Nostradamus.
They were Nostradamus, exactly. So, okay, so they like to talk about the Nakba, right? What is the Nakba? And that it's really their land. So from 1517 to 1917, Bob, who controlled the area?
From 15 to 17?
1517 to 1917. It was the Ottomans.
Yeah.
For 400 years, the Ottoman Muslims controlled the area. For centuries beforehand, there were different groups of Muslims who controlled the area. None of them were called Palestinians. Before that, you had the Christian Crusaders for 100 years controlled it. They weren't Palestinian. And before that, you had various empires also, the Persians, the Romans, going back to the year 70. So when Israel had its temple destroyed by the Romans and we were dispersed, well, actually, that was the first Holocaust. The Romans roughly killed half of us and exiled most of the rest of us, with some of us staying in the country. And there were always Jews there since 1500 before Christ. So the Jews actually, since a little history lesson is probably needed, the Jews showed up around 2,000 years before Christ. Let's call it BCE, before the Common Era. And we were there with Abraham and his family for a few hundred years until, as we know, Joseph got sold into slavery, and then the family in Egypt, and then the family went to Egypt because of the famine in Israel. And so they left the land of Israel. Things didn't work out so well in Egypt. We became slaves. And then God redeemed us with help, led by Moses. And we finally got back to Israel roughly 1500 BCE. So from 1500 to 1000, it was the period of the judges, which were no centralized government. Each of the 12 tribes of Israel roughly ruled themselves, led by one of their judges. There was also on the Gazan coast, there was a group called the Philistines, not the Palestinians. These were the Philistines. When we mentioned David and Goliath previously. So Goliath was a Philistine. The Philistines were the ones who captured Samson and poked his eyes out. So the Philistines were European seafaring people who came from Crete. There is nothing Arab or Muslim about them. And they were our nemesis for roughly 500 years until King David, around 1000 BCE, finally got rid of them. So the Jews had solid control from 1500 to, well, sadly the kingdom of Israel split in half after Solomon's sons took over into the northern and southern kingdoms. About 150 years later, the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria because they didn't follow God's Torah. The southern kingdom lasted for many, many more years. The Romans conquered us in the 300 BCE. Not the Romans, the Greeks, excuse me, Alexander the Great. And he liked to make everyone Greek, but he respected the Jews enough. And he said, okay, you guys can stay and do exactly how you are, practice your Judaism. You don't have to become Greek. And it's just, we're the bosses. And the Jews said, okay, and they could accept that. Obviously, it's not ideal, but they were in the land of Israel and were able to practice Judaism. They just didn't have their sovereignty. Then 150 years later, the Jews there was a significant number of Jews called Hellenists who really wanted to be Greek or adopt the Greek traditions. And they put into the ear of King Antiochus, the current Syrian Greek ruler of Israel, that he should outlaw all practice of Judaism. And so he did. And we are right now in the middle of the Hanukkah celebration. And
we should mention that the Hellenists were pretty much exactly like the Reformed and conservative Jews of today.
They are like the Jews who want to be to fit into the local population where they are. Yes, they are. That can definitely be a correct analogy. And so it's kind of interesting how they celebrate Hanukkah when they would be the enemy of the Maccabees. So this small group of Jews called the Maccabees, they fought against both the Greeks and against the Hellenists. Took years, but they took control of the state of Israel. They threw greatest army in the world, the greatest power in the world, the Greek Empire, out. They defeated them, and they rededicated the temple, and that's what Hanukkah is, the rededication of the temple.
And the first people that the Maccabees killed in that war were the liberal Jews.
Well, there was the Greeks came to, the representative of Antiochus came to the Modin, where the Maccabees were, and led by a Jewish priest named Matisyahu. And they asked Matisyahu to bow down to a Greek god, a statue of a Greek god, and he refused. And a Hellenist Jew did, and Matisyahu killed him. And then he yelled, "Whoever is with God, come with me." And 13 Jews ran off into the woods and started a revolt which defeated the greatest empire in the world. 13 Jews. So yes, it's a very, very misunderstood holiday on the Jewish calendar. So at no point in time was there a Palestinian anything in the land of Israel. So then we get to the Romans, and in the first century, the Romans had come in about 100 years prior, and they destroyed the temple in the year 70. And they decided to rename Jerusalem into Aelia Capitolia, and they renamed Israel or Judah into Palestine. Why? To stick it to us, because our ancient enemy was the Philistines. And so they wanted to stick it to us by changing our name to the name of our old adversary. And the first Arab didn't set foot on the land of Israel for about 600 years later, till the late 600s, when Muhammad founded Islam in 622, and he died after Muhammad died in 661. There was a split between the Sunnis and Shias, the groups that became the Sunnis and Shias, and one of them went out and went into Israel. They put their base in Syria, and they conquered Israel too. And in order to create some religious legitimacy for themselves, they built a temple, they built a mosque on top of the ruins of the Jewish temple. So it accomplishes two things. It gives themselves religious legitimacy, which they didn't have, because there's nothing, Jerusalem certainly isn't mentioned in the Quran, and it stops all of their people from going on pilgrimage down to Mecca and Medina, and it also makes it harder for the Jews to get our place back, because their thing is on top. So that was built in 691, which was, the Jews had already been in Israel for about 2,700 years by that time. And we've been there continuously for 2,200 years. And we've been there continuously for over 3,500 years now. And since the Arabs came in, they didn't create anything. They never founded any kind of Palestinian state. There was no Palestine caliphate. There was nothing. There was no, under the Ottomans for the last 400 years before World War I, there was no movement for free Palestine.
Rob, why are you letting facts get in the way of other people's fantasies? You
I
gotta
know.
stop that.
I know, it's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that it's fitting that we end on the note of Hanukkah, which Jews are celebrating today, even though they don't even know that Hanukkah was a war between the Jews and the Assyrian Greeks, and between the righteous Jews and the Jewish liberals of that day, that they're not taught in their so-called temples. So, it's kind of like the commercial where they have a disclaimer at the end of like a movie, any similarity between the characters depicted in the movie and those that are in real life is purely a coincidence. Well, in these temples, any similarity between what people are taught in these temples and Judaism is purely a coincidence. So let's end on that note.
I got a little bit more.
Okay, go ahead.
Got a little bit more. So I'm going to share the screen again. And here we have someone we hear his name a lot right now, Robert Kennedy. Well, because his son is now running for president. But Robert Kennedy pointed out that 500,000 Arabs came into Israel between 1932 and 1944 to take advantages of living conditions existing in no other Arab state. Meaning the British, instead of creating a Jewish homeland, they restricted the Jewish emigration into Free State Israel and allowed unfettered Arab immigration, because the Jews were creating economic activity, but they didn't have enough hands to work the fields, to work the factories. So the Arabs came in, and they found that the Jews were much better bosses than their fellow fellow Arab brethren were. So now, what does this mean? Well, so 500,000 came in. That's a lot of people. So now, when the state of Israel was founded, the Arabs talk about the Nakba, right? The Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. So what was the catastrophe? Well, what it was really was the Jews took sovereignty over any land in the Middle East. So that's the Nakba. What they say was 600,000 Arabs were expelled from their houses. And that's the Nakba. And they're sitting in refugee camps all around the Middle East, holding the keys to their former houses, right? We hear that all the time. And it has to be true, right? Because everybody says it all the time. So it has to be true. So is it true? No, it's not true. In 1948, when the 5 Arab armies attacked, 7 Arab armies attacked, excuse me, 7 Arab armies attacked Israel. They broadcast calls for all the Arabs living in Israel to leave. And they said, you'll come back in 10 days or 2 weeks. Let us go fight the Zionists, and we will annihilate them. And in 2 weeks, you can take your house back, and you can get whatever you want that the Jews left. And is this true, or am I just making this stuff up again? Well, here's a little video of a guy who left. Oh, hold on. Here we go.
هذه صورتي التي التقطت لي قبل الرحيل عن عين كارم بأسبوع، أي في شهر حزيران عام 48 أمام بيتنا هناك. اعتادت إذاعات الأنظمة العربية القول لنا: ابتعدوا عن الجبهة، إنها مسألة 10 أيام أو أسبوعين على الأكثر وسنعيدكم إلى عين كارم. واعتدنا القول: هذه فترة طويلة جدا. ماذا؟ أسبوعين؟ هذا كثير جدا. هكذا اعتقدنا، والآن طوينا 50 عاما.
So now 50 years have gone by. So that was, from 25 years ago.
When you have these woke revolutions,
but we get the point here. The point is, it's true that the Arabs, almost all of them left because they were told to leave by their fellow Arab regimes. Now, yes, it's true, 25 to 50,000 Arabs were pushed out by the Israeli army. Why? Well, they were only pushed out because in the heat of war, these folks were in the wrong place and they were helping the Arab regimes. So a tiny percentage were pushed out, 25 to 50,000, but the rest left voluntarily. You know, if you want to leave voluntarily, bye-bye, too bad. You picked the wrong side, tough. You know, that's how I feel. You had, prior to this war, there were 1 million Jews in Arab Muslim lands in the Middle East. After the war, there were roughly 10,000. Immediately after the war, virtually every Arab Muslim country vomited out, expelled every Jew. They took what they could carry and they left. And I'm not talking about the hundreds and hundreds of thousands who left Iran 30 years later. So that would be a lot more, but they didn't, by and large, they didn't leave in 48. So there was a population transfer of roughly 1 million Jews from the Arab world to Israel. Seems logical at this point to effectuate the conclusion of that transfer, because leaving the people there isn't going to be good for anybody. I think it seems to be the most humanitarian thing you can do. Give these guys a nice check, give every Arab family a nice check. You can give them a couple of $100,000 apiece and send them to Jordan, send them to Egypt, send them anywhere. Years ago, people I work with contacted the Canadian Foreign Ministry. They said every Palestinian family that had $250,000 in their pocket, they would take them in a heartbeat. So now you can also further see all of the BS that's involved here. Like in America right now, you see all these protests, and throughout Western Europe too, wanting to not just support Hamas, but to kill every Jew in the world. And you know it's all crap. It's not about supporting the creation of the state of Palestine, or against the false oppression, the fraudulent oppression of Arabs in Israel or in Gaza or in the West Bank, the Judea and Samaria. Why? Roughly 350,000 or more Arab Muslims were killed in Yemen recently. Was there a protest anywhere? Or did we hear crickets? Roughly 600,000 were killed in Syria recently. Crickets. Absolute crickets. The only reason that these people are taking to the streets is because it's the Jews doing it. It's the Jews who are now vulnerable, who can now be finished off. It has nothing to do with justice for Palestine, ending the apartheid rule of Israel. Apartheid, you know, you have all these mainstream supporters of Israel who correctly point out that Israel, the state of Israel, is not an apartheid state. I mean, there's Arab Muslims on the Israeli Supreme Court. Arabs have the right to vote. Arabs can participate in any trade they want to. As a matter of fact, Arabs even have it better, because Arabs are not obligated to go into the army, whereas the Jews are. So the Arabs have an advantage. They can go into the workforce sooner. There are not two separate bus lines or transportation lines, such as there's not two separate educational systems. Everything is one system. This is the antithesis of apartheid. And like I said, the only apartheid is against Jews who put God above the state of Israel. Those people are discriminated against. The Arabs are not. And the other claim we hear about Gaza is that it's an open air prison. Well, Gaza shares a border with Egypt. Why does Egypt? If it's a prison, that means Egypt's keeping it that too. But it's not. Even the anti-Jewish people Israeli establishment has to have some kind of a facade, and Hamas does make it hard for the Israeli establishment to normalize relationships with it, because it outright calls for the destruction of Israel and the murder of every Jew. So what do we want? What do these people actually want the government of Israel to do? Say, okay, sure, import all the weapons you want. Sadly, they don't need to import anything, because Israel gives them all the concrete and all the building supplies it needs to make their own weapons. And the Israeli army has told the political leadership that Hamas uses 95% of the concrete that Israel gives them to build their tunnels, which without their tunnels, they wouldn't be much, but they have their tunnels, which make it impossible. So it's a disaster all around, but the best solution would be simply to give these folks a lot of money, send them somewhere else, wherever they want to go to, and let them enjoy their lives. Take them away from the hot zone, so they can get on with their lives and don't have to think about sending their children to die for Allah. You know, one lady won election to the Gazan parliament. She said, she said, 3 of my sons have blown themselves up killing Jews, have become martyrs for Allah, and I've got 7 more who are willing to do it. You know, this is not the people that you make peace with. This is the people that have to be separated from you for our good and for their good. Not to mention, the Jewish Bible says if we don't separate them from us, they will be like thorns in our eyes until we do. And clearly, the Bible has got it right. So, and genocide, after those 600,000 Arabs left Israel in 48, and actually David Ben-Gurion begged them, sent trucks around the Arab areas with microphones, speakers, saying, don't leave. And they ran away because they were scared that we would do to them what they would have done to us. So they left. So 600 out of 750,000 left. There was down to 150,000 roughly. Now the Israeli Arabs number close to 2 million. Not much of a genocide there. You know, Israel is really bad at committing genocide. Then you have the population of Gaza and the so-called West Bank has exploded also over the last, okay, maybe that's the wrong term to use in this conversation. But the Gazan and Judean and Samaritan Arab populations have gone up by multiples in the last few decades. And this doesn't even take into account that roughly 300,000 Gazans have left over the last few years because they don't like living there. So let's help them to leave. That's really the only solution, because getting rid of Hamas is not going to end this, because the whole population is Hamas. The population is the crucible which Hamas came from. It is the crucible which the Palestinian Authority came from, namely the PLO. Do we want to live? Do we want to face reality? Or do we want to keep suffering until we do? Because the longer we do, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. We're going to have to face reality one day, and it might as well be now. That's pretty much it. What do you think, Bob?
There's nothing I can argue with. It's obvious. And you keep thinking that maybe after the Holocaust of Hitler, that Jews would wake up but apparently they don't. And so people like yourself, who are very rare, unfortunately, have to keep driving home the truth and not worry about being woke and not worry about what other people think. Only worry about facts. Facts are, as Reagan once said, facts are a stubborn thing. And we've got to stick to the facts. And if people don't like it, well, that's just too bad. So I thank you very much. And we're going to have to spread this knowledge far and wide. And Chag Sameach, Happy Hanukkah. And for our Gentile friends, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And to our Jewish friends, please wake up. Get out of your constant state of somnambulism. In other words, you're asleep, like a bunch of Joe Bidens, and wake up before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Chag Sameach to you too.